Welcome to Haggy Reads for You on Wolf Spirit Radio. Colleen, Haggy, reads children's stories for the wee ones up to the teens. She also reads books for grown-ups. Tune in, kick back, relax, and listen in. You're listening to Wolf Spirit Radio.
Hi everyone, it's Colleen, and this is Friday, February 19th, 2016, and this is the time slot for Do It Natural, but I'm not going to do It Natural. I'm going to read a book called I, the Unspeakable by Walt Sheldon. It's a PDF found on the Gutenberg.org site, and it's a book called I, the Unspeakable by Walter J. Sheldon. And it was produced from Galaxy Science Fiction, April 1951. What's in a name? Might be very dangerous to ask in certain societies in which sticks and stones are also a big problem. I fought to be awake. I was dreaming, but I think I must have blushed. I must have blushed in my sleep. Do it, she said. Please do it for me. It was the voice that always came, low, intense, seductive. The sound of your hand on silk, and to a citizen of Northam, a conformist, it was shocking. I was a conformist then. I was still one that morning. I awoke. The glow light was on, slowly increasing. I was in my living machine in Center 4, where I belonged, and all the familiar things were about me. Reality was back, but I was breathing very hard. I lay on the pneumo a while before getting up. I looked at the chroner, 07:03 hours, day 17, month 9, new century 3. My morning neuro tablets had already popped from the tube, and the timer had begun to boil an egg. The egg was there because the real food allotment had been increased last month. The balance of trade with Southam had just swung a decimal or two our way. I rose finally, stepped to the mirror, switched it to positive, and looked at myself. New wrinkles, or maybe just a deepening of the old ones. It was beginning to show. The past 2 years were leaving traces. I hadn't worried about my appearance when I'd been with the Office of Weapons. There I'd been able to keep pretty much to myself, doing research on magnetic mechanics as applied to space drive. But other jobs, where you had to be among people, might be different. I needed every possible thing in my favor. Yes, I still hoped for a job even after 2 years. I still meant to keep on plugging, making the rounds. I'd go out again today. The timer clicked and my egg was ready. I swallowed the tablets and then took the egg to the table to savor it and make it last. As I leaned forward to sit, the metal tag dangled from my neck, clutching the glow light, my identity tag. Everything came back in a rush. My name, the dream and her voice, and her suggestion. Would I dare? Would I start out this very morning and take the risk, the terrible risk? You remember renumbering. 2 years ago. You remember how it was then, how everybody looked forward to his new designation, and how everybody made jokes about the way the letters came out, and how all the records were for a while fouled up beyond recognition. The telecomics kidded remembering, renumbering. One went a little too far, and they psycho-scanned him, and then sent him to Marskull as a dangerous nonconform. If you were disappointed with your new designation, you didn't complain. You didn't want a sudden visit from the deacons during the night. There had to be renumbering. We all understood that. With the population of Northam already past 2 billion, the old designations were too clumsy. Renumbering was efficient. It contributed to the good of Northam. It helped advance the warless struggle with Southam. The equator is the boundary. I understand that once there was a political difference, and that the two superstates sprawled longitudinally, not latitudinally, over the globe. Now they're pretty much the same. There is the truth, and they are both geared for war. They are both efficient states, as tightly controlled as an experiment with enzymes, as microsurgery, as the temper of a diplomat. We were renumbered then, in Northam. You know the system. Everybody now has 6 digits and an additional prefix or suffix of 4 letters. State leader, for instance, has the designation AAAA 11-111. Now, to address somebody by calling off 4 letters is a little clumsy. We try to pronounce them when they're pronounceable. That is, no one says to state leader, "Good morning, AAAA." They say, "Good morning, ah." Reading the last quote, I notice a curious effect. It says what I feel. Of course, I don't feel that way on that particular morning. I was still conformal. The last thing on my mind was that I would interfract and be psychoscanned. 4 letters, then, and in many cases a pronounceable 4-letter word. A 4-letter word. Yes, you suspect already. You know what a 4-letter word can be. Mine was. It was unspeakable. The slight weight on my forehead reminded me that I still wore my sleep learner. I'd been studying administrative cybernetics, hoping to qualify in that field, although it was a poor substitute for a space drive expert. I removed the band and stepped across the room and turned off the oscillator. I went back to my egg and my bitter memories. I will never forget the first day I received my new 4-letter combination and reported it to my chief as required. I was unthinkably embarrassed. He didn't say anything. He just swallowed and choked and became crimson when he saw it. He didn't dare pass it to his secretarial engineer. He went to the administrative circuits and registered it himself. I can't blame him for easing me out. He was trying to run an efficient organization, after all, and no doubt I upset its efficiency. My work was important. Magnetic mechanics was the only way to handle quanta reaction, or the so-called non-energy drive, and was therefore the answer to feasible space travel beyond our present limits of Mars. And there were frequent inspection tours by bigwheels and very important persons. Whenever anyone, especially a woman, asked my name, the embarrassment would become a crackling electric field all around us. The best tactic was just not to answer. The chief called me in one day, and he looked haggard. Old man," he said, not quite being able to bring himself to utter my name, "I'm going to have to switch you to another department. How would you like to work on nutrition kits? Very interesting work." Nutrition kits? Me on nutrition kits? Well, I know it sounds unusual, but it justifies. I just had the Cybes work it over in the light of present regulation, and it justifies. Everything had to justify, of course. Every act in the monthly report had to be covered by regulations and cross-regulations. Of course, there were so many regulations that if you just took the time to work it out, you could justify damn near anything. I knew what the chief was up to. Just to remove me from my post would have taken a year of applications and hearings and innumerable visits to the Capitol and Center 1. But if I should deliberately infract, it would enable the chief to let me go, the equivalent of resigning. I'll infract, I said. Rather than go on nutrition kits, I'll infract. He looked vastly relieved. Fine, he said. I rather hoped you would. It took a week or so. Then I was on non-productive status and issued an NP book for my necessities. Very few luxury coupons in the NP book. I didn't really mind at first. My new living machine was smaller but basically comfortable, and since I was still a loyal member of the state and a verified conformist, I wouldn't starve. But I didn't know what I was in for. I went from bureau to bureau, office to office, department to department, any place where they might use a space drive expert. A pattern began to emerge, and the same story was everywhere. When I mentioned my specialty, they would look delighted. When I handed them my tag and they saw my name, they would go into immediate, polite confusion. As soon as they recovered, they would say they'd call me if anything turned up. Well, a few weeks of this, and I become a bit dazed. And then there was the problem of everyday existence. You might say it's lucky to be an MP for a while. I've heard people say that. Basic needs provided, worlds of leisure time. On the surface, it sounds attractive. But let me give you an example. Say it is monthly real food day. You go to the store, your mouth already watering in anticipation, and you take your place in line and wait for your package. The distributor takes your coupon book and is all ready to reach for your package, and then he sees the fatal numbers, MP, non-producer. A drain upon the state. You can see his stare curdle. He scowls at the book again. Not sure this is in order. Better go to the end of the line. We'll check it later. You know what happens before the end of the line reaches the counter. There's no more packages. Well, I couldn't get myself off MP status until I got a post, and with my name, I couldn't get a post. Nor could I change my name. You know what happens when you try to change something already on the records. The very idea of wanting to change implies criticism of the state. Oh, unthinkable behavior. That was why this curious dream voice shocked me so. The thing that it suggested was quite as embarrassing as its non-standard, emotional, provocative tone. Bear with me, I'm getting to the voice, to her, in a moment. I want to tell you first about the loneliness, the terrible loneliness. I could hardly join group games at any of the rec centers. I could join no special interest clubs or even state loyalty chapters. Although I dabbled with rhetoric research in my own quarters, I could scarcely submit any findings for publication, not with my name attached. A pseudonym would have been non-regulation and illegal. But there was the worst thing of all. I could not mate. Funny, I hadn't thought about mating until it became impossible. I remember the first time, out of sheer idleness, I wandered into a eugenics center. I filled out my form very carefully and submitted it for analysis and assignment. The clerk saw my name and did the usual double-take. He coughed and swallowed and fidgeted. He said, "Of course you understand that we must submit your application to the woman authorized to spend time in the mating booths with you, and that she has the right to refuse." "Yes, I understand that." He said, and dismissed me with a nod. I waited for a call in the next few weeks, still hoping, but I knew no woman would consent to meet a man with my name, let alone enter a mating booth with me. the urge to reproduce myself became unbearable. I concocted all sorts of wild schemes. I might infract socially and be classified a non-conform and sent to Marskol. I heard rumors that in that desolate land, on that desolate planet, both mingling and mating were rather disgustingly unrestricted. Casual mating would be terribly dangerous, of course, with all the wild, irradiated genes from the atomic decade still around, but I felt I'd be willing to risk that. Well, almost. About then, I began to have these dreams. As I've told you, in the dream there was only this woman's seductive voice. The first time I heard it, I awoke in a warm sweat and swore something had gone wrong with the sleep learner. You never hear the actual words with this machine, of course. You simply absorb the concepts unconsciously. Still, it seemed an explanation. I checked thoroughly. Nothing wrong. The next night I heard the woman's voice again. "Try it," she said. "Do it. Start tomorrow to get your name changed. There will be a way. There must be a way. The rules are so mixed up that a clever man can do almost anything. Do it, please, for me." She was not only trying to get me to commit nonconformity, but making heretical remarks besides. I awoke that time and half expected a deacon to pop out of the tube and turn his electric club upon me. And I heard the voice nearly every night. It hammered away. What if you do fail? Almost anything would be better than the miserable existence you're leading now. One morning I even caught myself wondering just how I'd go about this idea of hers, wondering what the first step might be. She seemed to read my thoughts. That night she said, "Consult the Sibes in the GovPub office. If you look hard enough and long enough, you'll find a way." Now, on this morning of the 17th day in the 9th month, I ate my boiled egg slowly and actually toyed with the idea. I thought of being on productive status again. I'd almost lost my fanatical craving to be useful to the state. But I did want to be busy, desperately. I didn't want to be despised anymore. I didn't want to be lonely. I wanted to reproduce myself. I made my decision suddenly. Waves of emotion carried me along. I got up, crossed the room to the directory, and push-buttoned to find the location of the nearest GovPub office. I didn't know what would happen, and almost didn't care. Like most important places, the GovPub office in Center 4 was underground. I could have taken a tunnel car more quickly, but it seemed pleasanter to travel topside. Or maybe I just wanted to put this off a bit, think about it, compose myself. At the entrance to the GovPub, Warren, there was a big director Sibe, a plate with a speaker and a switch. The sign on it said to switch it on and get close to the speaker, and I did. The Sibe's mechanical voice, they never seemed to get the TH sounds right, said, "This is Branch 4 of the Office of Government Publications. Say publications and or information desired as thoroughly and concisely as possible. Use approved voice and standard phraseology." Well, simple enough so far. I had always rather prided myself on my knack for approved voice, those flat, emotionless tones that indicate efficiency, and I would never forget how to speak staid ease. I said, "Applicant desires all pertinent information relative assignment, change or amendment of state serial designations, otherwise generally referred to as nomenclature." There was a second's delay while the audio patterns tripped relays and brought the memory tubes in. Then the Sibe said, Proceed to numbering and identity section. Consult alphabetical list and diagram on your left for location of same. Thanks, I said absent-mindedly. I started to turn away, and the Sahib said, Information on tanks is military information and classified. State authorization for... I switched it off. Numbering and identity wasn't hard to find. I took the shaft to the proper level, and then it was only a walk of a few hundred yards through the glow-lit corridors. In and I turned out to be a big room, somewhat circular, very high-ceilinged, with banks of Sahib controls covering the upper walls. Narrow passageways, like spokes, led off in several directions. There was an information desk in the center of the room. I looked that way and my heart went into free fall. There was a girl at the information desk, an exceptionally attractive girl. She was well within the limits of acceptable standard, and her features were even enough, and her hair a middle blonde, but she had something else, hard to describe. It was a warmth, a buoyancy, a sense of life, an intense animation. It didn't exactly show, it radiated. It seemed to sing out from her clear complexion, from her figure, which even a tunic could not hide, from everything about her. And if I were to state my business, I would have to tell her my name. I almost backed right out then. I stopped momentarily, and then common sense took hold, and I realized that if I were to go through with this thing, here would be only the first of a long series of embarrassments and discomforts. It had to be done. I walked up to the desk, and the girl turned to face me, and I could have sworn that a faint smile crossed her lips. It was swift, like the shadow of a bird across the lawns of one of the great parks topside. Very non-standard. Yet I wasn't offended. If anything, I felt suddenly and disturbingly pleased. "What information is desired?" she asked. Her voice was standard, or was it? Again I had the feeling of restrained warmth. I used colloquial, "I want to get the dope on state serial designations, how they're assigned and so forth, especially how they might be changed." She put a hand steno on the desktop and said, "Name, address, post." I froze. I stood there and stared at her. She looked up and said, "Well?" No post at present, MP status." Her fingers moved on the steno. I gave her my address, and she recorded that, and then I paused again. She said, "And your name?" I took a deep breath and told her. I didn't want to look into her eyes. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't find a decent excuse to. I saw her eyes become wide and noticed for the first time that they were a warm gray, almost a mouse color. I felt like laughing at the irrelevant observation, but more than that, I felt like turning and running. I felt like climbing and dashing all over the walls like a frustrated cat, and yelling at the top of my lungs. I felt like anything but standing there and looking stupid, meeting her stare. She looked down quickly and recorded my name. It took her a little longer than necessary, and that time she recovered somewhat. "All right," she said finally, "I'll make a search." She turned to a row of buttons on a console in the center of the desk and began to press them to various combinations. A typer clicked away. She tore off a slip of paper, consulted it, and said, "Information desired is in Bank 29. Please follow me." Well, following her was a pleasure anyway. I could watch the movement of her hips and torso as she walked. She was not tall, but long-legged, and extremely lithe, graceful and rhythmic, very, very feminine, almost beyond standard in that respect. I felt blood throb in my temples and was heartily ashamed of myself. I would like to be in a mating booth with her, I thought, the full authorized 20 minutes. And I knew I was unconformist, and the realization hardly scared me at all. She led me down one of the long passageways. A few moments later I said, "Don't you sometimes get, pretty lonely working here?" Personal talk at a time like this wasn't approved behavior, but I couldn't help it. She answered hesitatingly, but at least she answered. She said, "Not terribly. The Sahibs are company enough most of the time." "You don't get many visitors, then?" "Not right here, N&I isn't a very popular section. Most people who come to GovPub spend their time researching in the ancient manuscript room the social habits of the pre-atomic civilization." I laughed, and I knew what she meant, all right. Pre-atomics and their ideas about free mating always fascinated people. I moved up beside her. "What's your name, by the way?" "Lara 339827. I pronounced it Lara. Lara. That's beautiful. Fits you, too." She didn't answer. She kept her eyes straight ahead, and I saw the faint spot of color on her cheek. I had a sudden impulse to ask her to meet me after hours at one of the rec centers. If it had been my danger alone, I might have, but I couldn't very well ask her to risk discovery of a haphazard, unauthorized arrangement like that and the possibility of going to the psycho-scan. We came to a turn in the corridor, and something happened. I'm not sure just how it happened. I keep telling myself that my movements were not actually deliberate. I was to the right of her. The turn was to the left. She turned quickly, and I didn't, so that I bumped into her, knocking her off balance. I grabbed her to keep her from falling. For a moment we stood there face to face, touching each other lightly. I held her by the arms. I felt the primitive warmth of her breath. Our eyes held together, proton, electron, and I felt her tremble. She broke from my grip suddenly and started off again. After that, she was very businesslike. We came finally to the controls of Bank 29, and she stood before them and began to press button combinations. I watched her work. I watched her move. I almost forgotten why I'd come there. The lights blinged on and off, and the typers clacked softly as the machine sorted out information. She had a long printed sheet from the roll presently. She frowned at it and turned to me. "You can take this along and study it," she said, "but I'm afraid what you have in mind may be a little difficult." She must have guessed what I had in mind, and I said, "I didn't think it'd be easy. It seems that the only agency authorized to change a state serial under any circumstances is OPSYC. OPSYC? You can't keep up with all these changes in departments. The Office of Psychological Adjustment. They can change you if you go from a lower to a higher EAC. I don't get it exactly." As she spoke, I had the idea that there was sympathy in her voice, just an overtone. "Well," she said, "as you know, the post a person is qualified to hold often depends largely on his emotional adjustment category. Now, if he improves and passes from, let us say, grade 3 to grade 4, he will probably change his place of work. In order to protect him from any associative maladjustments developed under the old EAC, he is permitted a new number." I groaned. "But I'm already in the highest EAC." "It looks very uncertain, then." "Sometimes I think I'd be better off in the mines or on Marskull or in the hell of the pre-atomics." She looked amused. "What did you say your EAC was?" "Oh, all right, sorry." I controlled myself and grinned. "I guess this whole thing has been just a little too much for me. Maybe my EAC's even gone down." That might be your chance then. How do you mean? If you could get to the top man in OpPsych and demonstrate that your number has inadvertently changed your EAC, you might be able to justify a change. By the state he might, I punched my palm. Only how do I get to him? I can find his locations on the Cybe here, Center 1, the capital, for a guess. You'll have to get a travel permit to go there, of course. Just a moment. She worked at the machine again, trying it on general data. The printed slip came out a moment later, and she read it to me. Chief, OpPsych, was in the capital, all right. It didn't give the exact location of his office, but it did tell how to find the underground bay in Center 1 containing the OpPsych offices. We headed back through the passages then, and she kept well ahead of me. I couldn't keep my eyes from her walk. From the way she walked with everything below her shoulders, my blood was pounding at my temples again. I tried to keep the conversation going. Do you think it'll be hard to get a travel permit? Not impossible. My guess is that you'll be at Travbur all day tomorrow, maybe even the next day. But you ought to be able to swing it if you hold out long enough. I sighed. I know. It's that way everywhere in Northam. Our motto might ought to be, why make it difficult when, with just a little more effort, you can make it impossible? She started to laugh, and then, as she emerged from the passageway into the big circular room, she cut her laugh short. A second later, as I come along, I saw why. There were 2 deacons by the central desk. They were burly, and had that hard, pinched-face look, and wore the usual black belts. Electric clubs hung from their belts. Spidery-looking pistols were at their sides. I didn't know whether these 2 had heard my crack or not. I know they kept looking at me. Laura and I crossed the room silently. She backed to her desk, I to the exit door. The deacon's remote, disapproving eyes swung in azimuth, tracking us. I walked out and wanted to turn and smile at Laura, and get into my smile something of the hope that someday, somewhere, I'd see her again. But of course I didn't dare. I had the usual difficulties at Travbur the next day. I won't go into them except to say that I was battered from office to office like a ping-pong ball, and that when I finally got my travel permit, I was made to feel like I'd stolen an original Picasso from the State Museum. I made it in a day, just. I got my permit 30 seconds before closing time. I was to take the jet copter to Center 1 at 0700 hours the following morning. In my living machine that evening, I was much too excited to work at theoretical research, as I usually did after a hard day of tramping around. I bathed, I paced a while, I sat and hummed nervously, and got up and paced again, and I turned on the telepuppets. There was a drama about the space pilots who fly the nonconformist prisoners to the forest and pulp acetate plants from Mars. Seemed that the southern political prisoners who were confined to the southern hemisphere of Mars wanted to attack and conquer the North. The nonconformists, led by our pilot, came through for the state in the end. Corn is thicker than water, standard. There were, however, some good stereofilm shots of the limitless forests of Mars, and I wondered what it would be like to live there, in a green, fresh-smelling land. Pleasant, I supposed, if you could put up with the, no doubt, revolting morality of a prison planet. And the drama seemed to point out that there was no more security for the nonconformists out there than for us here on Earth. Maybe somewhere in the universe, I thought, there would be peace for men. Somewhere beyond the solar system, perhaps some day, when we had the means to go there. Yet instinct told me that that wasn't the answer either. I thought of a verse by an ancient pre-atomic poet named Hoffenstein. People had unwieldy, random combinations of letters for names in those days, and the poem went, "Wherever I go too, and spoil everything. That was it, the story of mankind. I turned the glow light down and lay on the pneumo after a while, but I didn't sleep for a long, long time. Then when I did sleep, when I had been sleeping, I heard the voice again. The low, seductive woman's voice. The startling, shocking voice, out of my unconscious. "You have taken the first step," she said. "You are on your way to freedom. Don't stop now. Don't sink back into the lifelessness of conformity. Go on and on. Keep struggling, for that is the only answer." I didn't exactly talk back, but in the queer way of the dream I thought objections. I was in my 30s, at the midpoint of my life, and the whole of that life had been spent under the state. I knew no other way to act. Suppressing what little individuality I might have was, for me, a way of survival. I was chock full of prescribed stereotype reactions, and I held on to them, even when something within me told me what they were. This wasn't easy, this breaking away. Not even this slight departure from the secure, camouflaged norm. "The woman, Laura, attracts you," said the voice. I suppose at that point I twitched or rolled in my sleep. Yes, the voice was right. The woman, Laura, attracted me. So much that I ached with it. Take her. Find a way. When you succeed in changing your name, and know that you can do things, then find a way. There will be a way. The idea at once thrilled and frightened me. I woke writhing in a sweat again. It was morning. I dressed and headed for the jetcopter stage in the ship for Center 1. The ship was comfortable and departed on time. A transport with seats for about 20 passengers. I sat near the tail and moodily busied myself, watching the gaunt brown earth far below. Between centers, there were mostly desert, only occasional patches of green. Before the atomic decade, I had heard, nearly all the earth was green, and teemed with life. Birds, insects, animals, people too. It was hard rock and sand now, with a few scrubs hanging on for life. The pre-atomics, who hadn't mastered synthesization, would have a hard time scratching existence from the earth today. I tried to break the sad mood, and started to look around at some of the other passengers. That was when I first noticed the prisoners in the forward seats. Man and woman. They were a youngish, rather nondescript couple, thin and very quiet. They were manacled, and 2 deacons sat across from them. The deacons' backs were turned to me, and I could see the prisoners' faces. They had curious faces. Their eyes were indescribably sad, and their lips seemed to be ready to smile at any moment. They were holding hands, not seeming to care about this vulgar emotional display. I had the sudden crazy idea that Laura and I were sitting there, holding hands like that, non-conforming in the highest, and that we were wonderfully happy. Our eyes were sad too, but we were really happy, quietly happy, and that was why our lips stayed with the brink of a smile. I sighed. My mood was just as sad, if not sadder, than it had been before. Later in the restroom I had a chance to talk to one of the deacons guarding these 2. I was washing my hands when he came in, and he nodded to me briefly and said, "Nice day for a flight." He seemed pleasant enough, more than I would have expected from a deacon. He was tall and blond and rather lithe. His shoulders sloped forward like a boxer's. "Taking those prisoners to Center 1, I asked. He nodded, "Yup. Habitual nonconforms. About as bad as they come." "What did they do?" He chuckled lasciviously. Kept meeting each other in the rec centers, didn't know what they were being watched. We nabbed 'em topside after they'd gone out to the desert together. What happens to them now, Marsco? They'd be lucky, brother, if that was only it. Oh, we'll ship 'em to Mars sooner or later, but first they gotta be interviewed. You mean for reclassification? No, just interviewed. We do it routine with everybody we pick up now, especially moral cases. That's how we crack down on other nonconforms. They got a regular organization, you know. They have? Sure. They're all Southern spies, trying to weaken us for an attack, that's all. I can spot 'em a mile away. I frowned and cleared my throat a little. Wouldn't you think that any spies would try to act as normal as possible and not call attention to themselves by infracting morally? He put a big finger on my chest. Listen, you got no idea. I see these buzzards in operation all the time. I know what goes on. Of course, I'm sure you do. I kept the sarcasm out of my voice, but it was a struggle. The finger tapped my chest once to every word, it seemed. We interview 'em all. Some of 'em, they really got nothing to tell us, and the interview kind of breaks 'em. Know what I mean? But we gotta do it. If we only get dope on other nonconforms from 1 out of 10, we figure we didn't waste our time. You mean these interviews of yours are a form of torture? He gave me a hard eye and say, we don't call it that, brother. We don't call it that. Well, of course, I said again, and went back to washing my hands. I watched the prisoners for the rest of the flight. I couldn't stop watching 'em. And all this time I kept thinking of Laura, visualizing her, seeing her young figure and her light hair and her mouse-colored eyes, and not really knowing why. I had the overpowering desire to spring forward and throttle the 2 deacons and help the prisoners to escape. Almost overpowering. I didn't, naturally. And the jet copter lowered toward the great green parks that cover the topside area of Center 1. It was really refreshing to see them. I understood that the lucky residents of Center 1 were allowed to wander in these parks and look at the growing things in the sky. Then, presently, the parks were out of sight again, and we were settling on the concrete landing stage, and I was back to reality. The first contact at the Office of Psychological Adjustment was, as usual, an information desk. There were people instead of Sibes to greet you, and I suppose that was because of the special complications of problems brought here. The Sibes have their limits, after all. A gray man with a gray eye and a face like a mimeograph bulletin looked at me and said in an approved voice and standard phraseology, "What information is desired?" I told him. His eyebrows rose as if suddenly buoyant. "Change your name? That's impossible." I quoted verse and chapter, the regulation covering it. He said. His eyebrows came down, cuddling into a scowl. "Well, that's highly unusual procedure. Better let me see your identity tag." I gave that to him, and he saw my MP status and then my unspeakable name, and his eyebrows went up again. "Perhaps you'd better get this straightened out with the general administration first," he said. He scribbled a slip of paper showing me how to get there. The rat race was on. I found general administration, and they sent me to activity control. Activity control said they couldn't do a thing until I was registered. I went to registration. Registration said, oh no, I shouldn't have been sent there, although they'd try to direct me to the proper office if I got an okay from Investigation and Security. INS said the regulation I had quoted had been amended, and I would have to have the amendment first, and I could find that in records. Records sent me back to the first place to get a search permit, and on and on and on. I kept at it doggedly. Toward the end of the day, my legs ached and head felt like a ball of granite. I had discovered that OPSYCH had nearly as many levels and tunnels and bays as Center 4 in its entirety, and if I had taken the intercom cars when possible, but most of it had been walking. I tightened my jaw and pulled my stomach in. I'd get to see the chief if it took me a year. That was hyperbole, of course. No man could last a year walking these dim, monotonous, aseptic corridors. But can I describe the feeling? The corridors are the same wherever you go. The glow light comes steadily, unblinkingly, from the walls, and the color is a dead oyster white. There's always the feeling of being lost, even when you know, or think you know, exactly where you are. It was near the end of the day, and I was back at the information desk. "You again?" said the gray man with the gray eye. "Records say I need a search permit. I have to find an amendment on the regulation covering my case. Why don't you just give up? You're causing us a great deal of trouble, you know. We have other work to do, important work. So have I. I'm a magnetic mechanics expert. I could be working for the state right now if I could get a post, and I can't get a post till my name's changed. That's ridiculous. Oh, I agree, but it's true just the same. Well, here's your search permit, and I still think you'd be wiser to forget it, and you'd save us a lot of fuss." I leaned across the desk. "You could save the whole organization a lot of fuss if you'd direct me to the chief's office. Then I could take my case up to him directly. I've been keeping my eye open for it, but I can't find it anywhere, and of course nobody'll direct me there, even if they know where it is." He stared at me with mild horror. "Go direct to the chief's office without going through the channels?" "Well, that's what I had in mind." "Then you better get it out of your mind. That's pretty dangerous thinking. That's close to infraction." "All right," I sighed. "I'll do it the hard way." I took the search permit and went back to records. I was still searching for the amendment when closing time came. I went back into the dim white corridors and found a food mart, got some neutro pills, and reviewed the day. These workers here in Center 1 were experts at putting you off. They were much more skillful than the officials in Center 4. Maybe that was why they were in Center 1. Maybe I would never wear them down. That thought came along and formed a ball of ice right in the bottom of my stomach. I had to think, and I had to think and rest. Real air, and a night breeze would help. I found a shaft and went topside. I started walking along a winding trail in the great park. The stars were out. They were diamonds, grounded dust, and thrown carelessly across the black velvet of the sky. The moon had not yet risen. There was a breeze, cool and light, and it brought temporary sanity. At least it helped me realize I was tired. I came to a little brook, and instead of crossing the footbridge, I turned and followed the brook upstream. It led through groves of trees, and pleasantly I found a little clearing where the bank sloped gently and was covered with soft moss. At the water's edge, the bank and a rock formation made a kind of overhanging ledge, and I sat on this a while and stared at the water, liquid silver, tumbling below. Finally I moved up the bank a little, wrapped my cloak around me, and lay down. I looked at the stars. I wondered which one might be Mars. It was red, I'd heard, but I saw nothing like that. Probably it wasn't visible now. I got to thinking about Mars, and I got to thinking about the prison colony there, and then I got to thinking about the primitive life, and then the free mating. That made me think of Laura and her firm body and long, lean limbs and blonde hair and mouse-colored eyes. And I drifted off to sleep. Laura stayed with me. She stepped into my dream. It was a wonderful dream. Her voice, when she broke from standard, was thrilling and delicious. It was linked with the tumbling of the brook somehow. She was warm and vibrant in my arms. She was alive, so alive. She was all movement. We were laughing together, and I awoke to the sound of shooting. The moon had risen, and the broad glades were silver green, and the trees were casting shadows. Voices were barking back and forth within the woods. "Over that way," called one. "Cut 'em off! Cut 'em off!" yelled another. A man and a woman, both entirely naked, both speckled with wounds and bruises, all standard and questioning, stumbled into the clearing. Their eyes were wild, big for their faces. They were thin. They gasped for breath. They looked around them. Rats in mazes. And they saw me. They drew back. "This way!" called a voice from the wood. Another shot rang out. I stared at the man and woman, still too surprised to know what to say or do. They were the two prisoners I had seen in the jet copter on the way to Center 1. Maybe I was not quite awake. Maybe I was not really bright, though everybody thinks of himself as bright, I suppose. Maybe it was everything that had happened since the renumbering. Maybe I was fed up, and maybe something about the quiet woods called out, "Rebel! Rebel!" I don't know. I pointed to the brook, the overhanging bank, and said, "In there, quick!" They scuttled. They passed me and looked at me, half thankfully, half fearfully. The voices came nearer. "Come on, this way, they can't get far." I wrapped myself in a cloak and sat down, and pretended to be gazing at the stars. A moment later, 3 deacons burst upon the clearing. I turned slowly and stared at them, showing mild, artificial surprise. Handsome, burly fellows. The one in the middle was a positive Apollo. I was sure that he waved his hair, and he glared at me. "You," he said. "Me?" "Yes, you. What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm sitting here." "What for?" "The night air. To study the stars, get a change of scene." I shrugged. Apollo stepped forward and held out his hand. "Your tag?" This was it. When he saw my 4-letter name, he'd really start working on me. I unsnapped the tag from my neckband and handed it to him. He looked at it but didn't change expression. The deacons are well trained. He looked up again. "MP? Eh?" "Yes." "And you belong in Center 4? "Yes." "Explain." I did, or tried to. Things were roiling around inside me, keeping me from thinking clearly. Once, as I talked, I thought I heard movement under the bank, but the deacons didn't seem to notice anything. I tried to tell them of my troubles, but there was no sympathy in their eyes. Apollo said, "See anybody pass by here?" "Pass by?" I hoped my look was innocent. "Who?" "2 fugitives, nonconforms. Escaped during interview. Got the 4-screen turned off somehow. Must have been spies helping 'em. You didn't see 'em, huh?" I shook my head. "I haven't seen anyone for several hours." Apollo and his 2 friends traded glances. The one on the right was bull-necked and red-headed. The one on the left had a neck and a nose like a crane. It was the one on the left who suddenly smiled. Not a pleasant smile. He stepped up to Apollo and whispered something in his ear. Then Apollo smiled and turned to me again. "You sure you haven't seen anyone?" He knew something, I didn't know what, but it was too late to back out now, and I said, "Of course I'm sure." Apollo kept his eyes on me, hard, flat, stony, and held out his hand to the crane-like deacon. "Your light," he said. The other handed it to him. Apollo flashed it on the ground. It came to rest upon unmistakable footprints in the soft moss. They led to the bank. I could be certain of arrest, and one of their little interviews now. I really had nothing to lose, nothing that wasn't already lost. "Run!" I shouted at the top of my lungs. "They're coming!" There was a rustling under the bank. I leaped at Apollo. I leaped hard, with my feet solid, pushing me forward. My shoulder hit him in the midriff, and he went down. I scrambled over him and jammed my thumb into his shoulder, and he screamed. There was a buzzing sound and the smell of burned flesh, and 1/10 of a second later I felt pain. One of the others had jammed his electric truncheon into the small of my back. It bored in, it burned, and I writhed and yelled. I couldn't help it, and I rolled over. Someone was kicking at me. I grabbed his leg and pulled him down, and when he struck the ground, I twisted. Another shape blurred toward me, Apollo, recovered and on his feet again. Then buzzing, burned flesh, and the pain this time in the back of my neck. My head swirled and I thrashed, trying to get away. Get away where? That made not much difference. Away, that was all. The buzzing continued. It was through my flesh now and touching the spine. It would destroy the nerves in a moment and I'd be dead or even worse, a limp cripple, a rag doll. The smell of roasted flesh and hair was a thick, choking, sickening fog of decay. I couldn't breathe. There was blackness, swirling and concentric, closing in. I think one of them kicked me in the groin before I lost consciousness. I couldn't be sure. I couldn't be sure of anything. Coming out, sound before sight, and I heard the low voices. My eyes were already open. Nebulous shapes, now sharpening. I was in a small room with gleaming metal walls, and I was on my back, on a sort of table. 3 men were in the room with me, standing over me. Apollo, the bull-necked man, the man with a nose like a crane. Well, it's getting close to the top of the hour, so I reckon I better stop there. I'm really enjoying this PDF, again, found on Gutenberg.org, and this is the time slot for Do It Natural, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be doing it natural anyway, so I just thought I'd fill this in. And it is a part of Haggie Reads for You, and I am Haggie of Haggie Shack Radio. And please remember that Haggie Shack Radio and Wolf Spirit Radio are both totally listener-supported. So if you like what you're hearing, please go to HaggieShack.com or WolfSpirit.com and hit the donate button and give what you can. And we appreciate any help that we get that way, because everything helps us stay on the air and producing. And with that said, I thank y'all for listening, and I'll see y'all later. Bye now.